Simon, thanks so much for joining us again. We got a really great response from what you were talking about last time, and the possibility that Russia is trying to de-escalate the situation, that maybe there could be a permanent solution for Donbas in the east. If that happens, what do you think that could look like?
Well, I think right now we don't know what kind of resolution they're going to find. The Ukrainians have to negotiate with the Russians via the representatives of the separatist republics in Minsk, and they're going to find some kind of a formula which works for the parliament in Ukraine, because they're going to have to vote in those constitutional amendments, and a formula that works for Putin's pride, so that he can tell his population that this war hasn't been for nothing, and so that he can rein in some of the nationalists. But what it's actually going to look like, we don't know until that negotiation is over, because there's a whole range of things. You could have the South Ossetia situation, which is the separatist region of Georgia that's controlled by Russia, where there is a border fence along most of the perimeter, where people are not allowed to cross from one side to the other. And if neighbors want to see each other and they're left on each side of the fence, then they have to go all the way to Russia to come in through a legal crossing to go and visit them. And what used to take 15 minutes now can take an entire day or 2 days to do. That's one end of the spectrum of what we've seen before. The other end of the spectrum, I guess, is the Transnistria region in Moldova, which runs itself, and there are checkpoints between it and the rest of Moldova, but local people can quite easily travel between Moldova and Transnistria, and there aren't really any real restrictions on that kind of a movement. So, and then there's everything in between. So, we could see a sort of Berlin Wall type situation, or something, a little bit lighter. I don't know what's going to come out, but I think whatever does come out is probably going to be better than the situation we've had over the last year and a half of war.
I mean, you talked a little bit about Putin's pride, and he's invested a lot in this, so it has to come away looking like a win, at least a PR win. Yeah. I mean, what would a PR win for Putin be? What could that look like?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of resistance to one likely demand, which is that the regions in the east have veto power over Ukraine's foreign policy decisions about whether it wants to join the European Union or whether it wants to join NATO. And I think that's certainly something that he's going to push for. He's going to probably demand that either Ukraine declares itself to be a neutral state that doesn't join these international organizations, or that the regional leaders in the future, Donetsk and Luhansk region of Ukraine, can veto a decision to join NATO. And of course he sees himself as controlling those leaders in eastern Ukraine, and therefore by extension controlling whether Ukraine can integrate further with the West.
Which is basically trying to limit Ukraine's sovereignty, right? I mean, that was something they pushed for under Yanukovych when they had this non-block status law that stopped Ukraine from being able to join NATO, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think he wants to have as much influence over Ukraine as he possibly can, and he sees any move westwards as a direct threat on Russia's interests, and so I think he's going to do whatever he can to block that. But at the same time, he is trying to come to some kind of an accommodation because of Russia's economic situation right now. He doesn't have a lot of room for maneuver, and I think he's actually trying to deflect attention from Ukraine by sending troops and equipment to Syria recently, and sort of recalibrating to some kind of a shift to the Middle East, where he can be seen maybe as a broker or goodwill actor, where he can suddenly be seen by the international community as somebody who's not necessarily always making trouble for everybody else, but maybe he can also present solutions sometimes too. And I think he's trying to go back on the image that he's created for himself and for his country over the last 2 years.
Well, people used to talk about handshake ability for Russia, this issue that they'd kind of not play by the rules, but at the end of the day they wouldn't cross the line and they could still have their hand shaken by other politicians. But it seems like now that's out the window. Is that something possible for Russia to regain?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because as unhandshakable as Russia is right now, it's going to become a lot more unhandshakable when the results of the investigation over MH17 come out later this year. There's 2 investigations, one by the aviation experts and a criminal investigation by the Dutch police, and both of those are going to be released in the next few months. And once they do, it's going to be very difficult for Western countries at the very least, and especially the countries which were affected by that disaster, Holland, also Malaysia, Australia, to shake hands with the leader of a country which is most likely going to figure very largely in these investigations as as being somewhat behind the disaster.
I mean, how much does the West really matter to Russia? Because it seems in times of crisis, Russia tries to act, or at least say that none of this matters, that it's not important, it does its own thing, it has its own spheres. But I was reading something by Mark Eliade the other day, and he was saying, really, even when you look at China, which is the only country that has kind of a major importance for Russia, it's mainly looked at in terms of as a replacement for the West, when they can't get the money they need and other things. So what is the West to Russia at this point?
Well, I think the West is everything to Russia because Russia sees itself in comparison to the West. Russia doesn't have its own vision for the future, even though it claims that it has its own path and it's trying to create its own path. But I mean, mostly what you hear from Russian leaders is a reaction to things that are happening to the West, not the other way around. There's also the economic importance, the trade. I think Germany is Russia's biggest trade partner. And the European Union definitely, as a whole, is Russia's biggest trade partner. So those two things go hand in hand.
Gotcha. And I mean, pivoting a little bit, to the issue of reconciliation, if things do calm down and it comes to a quieter moment, I mean, you spent a lot of time on the ground. What do you think the challenges are that would face people to live in the same country or to try and heal some of these wounds?
I think people are going to accept whatever the people with guns say they have to accept. At the end of the day, I think people are very flexible and they can live under any regime, and they just want to have safety, especially in those areas where there's been war all of this time. I think many people aren't thinking about the higher, loftier ideals of nationalism or whatever side of the camp they fall down on. I think most people are just going to accept a solution no matter what it looks like. To be honest, nobody's really been asking them their opinion this entire time. It's been the men with guns who have been making all the decisions, and I think that's how it's going to continue to be in this region, even after the solution, because that's going to be one of the main issues is how much a part of Ukraine is the East going to be if there are armed men over there who are not loyal to the central authorities running the show. So we might have a situation where on paper it's a part of Ukraine, but in fact the power lies with people who are loyal to Moscow.
And what do you think the challenge is to Ukrainian officials or to international officials who really don't have access to these areas but are trying to design policies for them or have some understanding of what's going on?
Well, I don't know what the thinking is on the Ukrainian side, to be honest, because there's not a lot that they can do to influence policy inside eastern Ukraine as things stand now. I mean, I'm sure there's most of what they say is declarative in nature, i.e. we'll never give up the region, it'll always be a part of Ukraine, etc., etc. But
that doesn't seem to match up with a lot of the actions people take.
For example?
Well, I mean, cutting off benefits or all these things, I mean, they really alienate a lot of the population.
Yeah, I don't really know I don't have any recommendations for what the Ukrainians should do.
So, just speaking generally, once more, what do you think the best situation for Ukraine would look like moving forwards, including Donbas?
Well, I mean, the best situation from Ukraine's point of view would obviously be to have total control over the Donbas and total control over Crimea. But I don't think that's a realistic situation at this point. I think, Ukraine should be looking at a compromise solution realistically, where they have some control over the Donbas. I think probably if they ever want to regain control over Crimea, then they need to be a lot more active about defending themselves on the international arena and in the courts, and making sure that companies that operate in that part of the world are sanctioned, and making it as difficult as possible for Russia to run that region. But I haven't seen very many steps in that direction. And you know what, perhaps there's some kind of a behind-the-scenes deal where we give you some control of the Donbas back, in exchange for that, you promise to not try to regain control of Crimea. You know, that's a possibility as well, although I don't know if we'll ever find out about that kind of a deal being made, because obviously it would be against the law.
And then for the flip side, I mean, what do you think is the worst likely or possible situation for Ukraine, for the country, including the East?
I think the most likely outcome, if the ceasefire holds, because this ceasefire could break down and we could come back to a war situation if Russia gets frustrated over its attempts to befriend again the international community, and if it sees that that's not going anywhere, it just might try to be the spoiler again to get the ball back in its side of the court. Right now, I think mostly we're just hoping that the ceasefire holds and that some kind of agreement gets hashed out. But we don't know what that agreement's going to look like until it gets hashed out.
I mean, why, when we're talking about, you know, DNR, LNR, these areas in the East, why isn't it appealing to Russia to annex them? Why isn't a Crimea situation likely?
Well, I think on the one hand, Russia can't really afford another region or another two regions to have to finance. It already is financing them to some extent and financing the military operation over there to some extent. So that's a big strain on Russia's economy, and the ruble's taken a big hit, and the economy as a whole's taken a big hit because of the price of oil falling. And the sanctions haven't helped as well. You know, the sanctions have been on key areas of the economy, like oil production. And Russia needs technology from the West to maintain the levels of oil production that it's had over the last few years. Without that technology, it's going to become poorer and poorer, and the government's going to have a lot less leverage even to control the regions that are inside the Russian Federation. So I think two new regions is just something that they can't pull off. It was something they thought they could pull off originally, most likely, when the oil price was high. But since it's gone down, I think that option's off the table.
And you mentioned you just came back from Georgia. I mean, talking about South Ossetia or Abkhazia, are there lessons for Ukraine to learn from that, from Georgia's example and what's gone on there?
You know, the conflict in Georgia has been much more long-standing than the conflict in Ukraine. The conflict in Ukraine came out of the blue and should have never happened because there was really no age-old enmity that had to play out between Ukraine and Russia necessarily. But Georgia lost control of its separatist regions in the early 90s during a nationalist uprising. And they were then controlled by the local ethnic groups that lived in those regions. And it was only in 2008 when Russia really stepped in and took control of those regions for itself from the local ethnic groups, bringing its own troops in and really cementing the fact that those areas are probably never going to be back under Georgian control. What lessons are there to draw for Ukraine from what happened over there? I don't know, perhaps it's that when they're negotiating what kind of a status the rebel areas of Ukraine should have, they should think about making life easier for the local people and to make sure that there's not a barbed wire all along the perimeter, making it difficult for local people to continue going back and forth and seeing their families and so forth. I think that's the most important thing. So no matter who's running the area, you know, local people should be affected as little as possible. And in South Ossetia, they're very much affected. And if they try to cross over the barbed wire, they get detained and fined, and they end up in prison. It makes life really hard for people over there. I don't want to see that happen in Ukraine.
All right, and one final question. I mean, what, in terms of reporting and trying to cover everything that's going on in Russia and Ukraine, I mean, what's changed? You had an issue with where they revoked your accreditation after the last piece you did on selfies. I mean, it seems like there's a lot going on to try and make the work of journalists harder and to really obscure a lot of what's going on now. So what's changed since the beginning of all this?
Well, Russia's really changed radically, you know, over the last couple of years, ever since the Sochi Games in 2014. It's just pretty much severed all of its ties with the outside world and is not as interested in looking like it's you know, it's not as interested in presenting the facade of democracy that it used to want to at least portray. And so I think they've become a lot more willing to ban certain journalists, undesirable human rights workers, international organizations based in Russia. They really just don't care that much anymore.
If you if you have fewer people with accreditation and they're not letting people in like they are in the DNR and Russia, and there's less focus on these issues in the media, or at least less insightful coverage, how does that affect how things proceed forward?
Badly. I mean,
I'll take it.
the less we know about Russia, the less we know about Russia. So, the more isolated Russia becomes, the worse it is for the Russian people, and the worse it is for everybody else, because Russia in isolation is a belligerent country that has lost contact with reality and the outside world, and is perhaps going to be more ready to take steps that even the Russians would have considered appalling a few years ago, and we don't want to see that happen.
All right, thank you so much. Always interesting getting to talk to you.